is Bill Brammell. I'm a lead ecologist with Mosaic. I'll be jointly presenting with Shelley Thornton. The second half will focus on offsite mitigation. What I'm going to talk about is the integrated habitat network and conservation lands overview from a Mosaic perspective. I've kind of jotted down 6 general themes that I've kind of heard through all the presentations this morning, and they've all been great presentations. And hopefully, my presentation will kind of tie some of these things together. They're very common themes that go through my presentation and what has been presented. A lot of talk about prescribed fire. It's a tool we use. GIS technology, I'll touch on a little bit of that in my presentation. Cooperative land management, public-private partnerships, very important to us and again to the rest of the audience here. Scrub jays and scrub habitat management, I'll touch on that briefly. And also corridor connection. That's kind of really what the backbone of the IHN is wildlife corridor connections. So with that, the IHN was initially developed by DEP in the early 90s. Basically, it was meant to help guide reclamation through the Central Florida Phosphate District. It also had the stated goal of trying to connect and maintain connections off-site further downstream to the south, to the west, and to the north. Was originally developed in the 90s. It was based largely just on aerial photo interpretation, topographic maps. It followed the major drainage features of the area of the basin, Peace and Myakka, and the tributaries. So it was kind of a large-scale planning effort to, again, try and guide reclamation and habitat management and maintain corridor connections. And this basically shows you the initial, there was 8 core areas that developed that really started the IHN going, and these were established in the early 90s. It was about 6,200 acres. Those are shown in purple on the slide here, and then the blue veiny network there is what DEP considered or thought would be the IHN network and corridor. Again, it started in the early 90s, and as the IHN concept and corridor planning has progressed, we've seen the need for recognized improvements to corridor connections. Again, a lot of it's based on improved technology, mapping technology, GIS, the actual improvement of aerial photos. You can see a lot more signature on aerial photos now compared to the early 90s. So Mosaic, in cooperation with DEP, is looking at revisions to the IHN, first within Mosaic lands and then beyond Mosaic lands. And it was always envisioned to be a living document, adaptive to change. Again, we've got more information, boots on the ground, what these habitats look like and where we can see improved connections. Now, this provides an example of one such improved connection. This is the showing 2 different basins, the Myakka Basin kind of over here and the Peace River Basin over here. And this is the Altman tract permit boundary. And the green in here, it was the original concept of the IHN, again, back from early 90s. Through the permitting of the Altman tract, we have conserved about a 520-acre parcel, generally called the Central Marsh area. And what this does is you can see now an improved connection here to the Manatee County Duet Preserve, and also providing connection between 2 different watersheds, which I think is pretty important. This extends this corridor up and through here, and this historically was a ditched connection to these wetlands north of 37 here. As part of the permitting of this tract, we were required to provide a stream restoration plan for that ditch segment. It basically reintroduced the meanders to the stream and improved the habitat along the riparian corridor of that system. Now, again, I'd like to get into kind of just a broad overview of our conservation program. To date, we have approximately 20,000 acres currently committed to conservation easements, about 9,000 or so pending. Another important component of our conservation program is the donation through Mosaic and predecessor companies of about 16,000 acres that are in public parks. The Alafia River State Park is an example, Hardy Lakes Park is an example. These are parks that offer both recreational benefit and also wildlife habitat benefit. Again, building on the theme of the IHN and conservation easements, this is a representative showing the South Fort Meade conservation easements currently committed to date. It's about 7,500 acres. And one of the goals of the AHN was to improve on their corridor connections and expand where possible. So you see several expansions of what was originally the IHN along this branch here, so a wider connection here. Several of these tributaries now that are committed to conservation easement that weren't originally envisioned as part of the IHN. As previously mentioned, Melissa gave a great presentation on prescribed fire. That's basically the main management tool we use at the Altman Preserve, the Central Marsh area. There was mention earlier about wildlife concerns. We actually have a pretty rigorous burn program at the Central Marsh, but you'll see here these buffers, which are eagle's nests, which we actually have to manage and burn around. Again, showing just, fire in action, maintained fire break here and kind of the low flame mosaic, spreading through the flatwoods in here, opening up the canopy for listed species, gopher tortoises, other species, and then, obviously preserving around the eagle's nest there and maintaining a buffer around that during burns. This is another example of a recently granted conservation easement. This was the Altman Preserve here, and we're just immediately adjacent to that is what we call the Fort Greene xeric site. We've recently permitted this as part of we have a new MOA with FWC regarding permitting of gopher tortoises on Mosaic lands. This property has been historically used for a recipient site for gopher tortoises. We've recently granted a conservation easement to it. It's about 260 acres of xeric restored habitat, but it also includes these marsh areas here, which are important because we also historically relocated gopher frogs, a commensal of the tortoise, so kind of the habitat working together, the wetlands and the uplands. And immediately to the south of here, maybe less than a mile, is the Fort Greene 10, 11, 12 site. Another part of the MOA was conserving new recipient sites. So this is about a 280 acre so site that is permitted as a gopher tortoise recipient site, conservation easement over it. It has to be actively managed and maintained to gopher tortoise long-term recipient site standards, which is basically less than 5% nuisance exotic species in perpetuity. This is the Mosaic well field, again, in Manatee County, southeastern Manatee County. And this is showing kind of the strategic importance of the well field, kind of centrally located. This is Duet Preserve to the north here, and various other state and DEP managed lands around it. Currently, it's serving as, we have a 150 acre conservation easement over a portion of the well field as part of our habitat conservation plan for Florida scrub jay and indigo snake. And we also recently permitted that as a gopher tortoise recipient site as well. The important part is, that is the acres under conservation easement. All 1,000 acres is actively managed, basically with prescribed fire. And keeping on the theme with partnerships and land management partnerships, again, this is showing the well field. In the early 2000s, we received approval of a habitat conservation plans to do an experimental translocation program of scrub jays, which has been presented to CHNEP before. But this shows the importance of cooperative land management. As the management in the well field started and the jays were translocated to the well field site in Manatee County, which does a great job managing its scrub to the north, this shows the birds that were originally relocated to the well field site beginning to disperse to other managed and maintained scrub areas. As you know, the jays are habitat specific and they have to have well managed and maintained scrub. This is a summary slide of the translocation program since its inception in the 2000s. And really the takeaway of this slide is basically in the last 3 years, we've maintained a stable population and a growing population of jays over the last 3 years, ranging from about 20 to 30 individuals to 76 to 85. Oh, had it backwards. The families are in the red, 20 to 25 families and 70 to 80 individual birds. And this is just showing the habitat management units of the well field. Again, it's actively managed with prescribed fire, a pretty intense program. The yellow just showing different fire breaks in management units. Prior to acquiring the property, it was very overgrown, encroachment of sand pines, too many scrub oaks, live oaks, kind of outcompeting the scrub. So we had to do a kind of a combination land management prescription, which was mechanical thinning and removal, and then introducing prescribed fire. These are just showing some of the habitat examples of the well field pre-management, kind of the overgrown nature of the scrub. You see these Perseas coming into the mid-canny, higher sand pine and slash pine, just kind of the overgrown nature of the palmetto. Again, just pre and post fire burns. These photos are taking the exact same photo spot, again, showing the benefits of prescribed fire in opening up the canopy. And this is how the well field looks today, kind of the classic maintained structure that you want to see in maintained scrub. Native herbaceous ground cover, some open areas for the jays and tortoises to forage, a next higher community of saw palmetto that's not too high but interspersed with native grasses, and then another higher level of the scrub oak community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shelley, and she's going to talk a little bit about our offsite mitigation programs.
Well, thank you. Well, to build upon Bill's presentation, I'd like to discuss how conservation lands are provided by Mosaic through on-site and off-site mitigation. And there's definitely a distinction between the two elements. On-site mitigation occurs within an active mine boundary that includes reclamation requirements to account for those mining activities. However, they do help enhance the IHN network that Bill just recently discussed. A couple of elements are associated with on-site mitigation projects. They are the preservation and protection of avoided lands, the in-kind establishment to replace those wetland and streams that have been impacted and their associated functions, as well as the protection of established wetlands and streams through perpetual conservation easements. So off-site mitigation is a little bit different in the fact that it is not mitigation that occurs on an active mine boundary. This occurs on property off-site that active mine. It can occur on currently owned, Mosaic-owned lands where the restoration activities actually go above and beyond what is currently permitted. It can occur on lands that we have purchased fee simple, or lands that we've actually just purchased a conservation easement to be able to perform some restoration activities. Some of those activities include hydrologic restoration, the enhancement of forested and herbaceous wetland systems, as well as stream restoration. So what are our compensatory mitigation requirements? Well, the federal requirements first off say to avoid wetland impacts, and when that is not feasible, to minimize those wetland impacts. The 2008 compensatory mitigation rule by the federal government does then identify 3 different methods for compensatory mitigation if there are unavoidable impacts. And there are mitigation banks. While there are currently permitted mitigation banks within the Peace and Niagara River watersheds where our proposed mine permits are located, unfortunately there's not sufficient nor the correct type of credits available for our needs. Next, it's in lieu fee programs, and currently there's no approved in lieu fee programs within the Central Florida Phosphate District boundary, nor are there any slated to be approved within the next couple of years. So what that leaves next is permittee responsible projects, and what we're calling here off-site mitigation projects. And that means the permittee, Mosaic, takes full responsibility to find a project to provide the necessary compensatory mitigation for our impacts. The state requirements are very similar, just different verbiage, to first eliminate wetland impacts, reduce wetland impacts, and if, again, there are any unavoidable wetland impacts, to provide a project that provides regional ecological value with greater long-term ecological value than the requested impacts. So what exactly is this off-site mitigation? They are projects that provide off-site wetland impacts that by preserving off-site wetlands outside that mine boundary, but within that same watershed. These off-site mitigation projects can be completed in whole or in phases, however, they must be in place, providing that necessary wetland function prior to any mining activities. So these off-site mitigation projects are actually included in our permits. So one of the permits we have in with the federal government as well as the state is our own a mine. there are several offsite mitigation projects associated with that permit. In order for the mine to be permitted, those offsite mitigation projects are also permitted and they're tied together. So we cannot complete any mining activities until those offsite mitigation projects are in place. So these offsite mitigation projects typically involve larger, more ecologically valued parcels. On average, the parcels that we're looking at are approximately 600 acres in size. But again, I want to point out that 600 acres is in addition to the reclamation practices that occur within the mine boundary. The average size of the Ona de Soto mines that are currently being permitted is about 20,000 acres. So these 600-acre parcels are in addition to that. There's rigorous and scientific analyses completed on these projects to make sure they are fully functional. And there's also a significant amount of resources involved with these projects. There is not only the cost associated with acquiring the land or the conservation easement, the cost of the restoration activities, but also the management through success and the costs associated with that. So as I said before, they'd like to see projects that focus on watershed and a regional value within those, as well as with local benefits. And the CHNEP Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan meets that definition of a watershed plan. So when we were looking for potential projects to satisfy this offsite mitigation need, we kept these four priority problems in mind and tried to find parcels of land to where, when the appropriate mitigation plan was implemented, we could help address some of those concerns. So this is just a list of some of the example priority actions in the CCMP and their methods of implementation. And with each of our offsite mitigation projects, we've taken a look at these priority actions and seen which one we can apply to that project to help best address them. So there's the restoration of freshwater riparian wetlands, the increase of acreage of land protected under a conservation easement, and all these offsite mitigation projects will ultimately be under a conservation easement. There's the protection of Horse Creek and Pain Creek. They are both two major headwater tributaries to the Peace River, and our currently proposed offsite mitigation projects address each of those creeks and their associated systems. We also want to reduce the non-point source pollutants and provide water quality buffers. So some of our wetland restoration techniques that we're implementing on these projects is to restore the wetland hydrology in areas that have been heavily ditched and drained due to different purposes, the enhancement of forested as well as herbaceous wetland systems, the maintenance of exotic and nuisance species, which ultimately these items will help provide significant ecosystem benefits to these watersheds. There's also stream restoration, and ultimately our goal of the stream restoration is to restore and protect through the physical and biological integrity of some degraded systems. And actually this picture here is one of our offsite mitigation projects. And as you can see, the riparian corridor has been heavily impacted and the vegetation removed. The pasture actually goes directly up to the stream. You can see from these white sands that it's been heavily eroded. So to go back and revegetate these riparian corridors will allow us to stabilize those stream banks, provide water quality buffer, as well as habitat for fish and microinvertebrates. Stabilizing these stream banks will also help reduce the amount of sediment that's transported downstream and ultimately allow us to reestablish the flow paths akin to historic conditions. So this is a map that Bill actually showed just a few minutes ago. And the things that are in the same are the areas in pink, and these are the approximate 7,400 acres and CEs that were granted or committed in the South Fort Meade area. Well, what's different is this area that's highlighted in yellow up here. This is one of the offsite mitigation projects that is proposed for the Ona mine. It's a Bolex Creek restoration project, and it's located right at the confluence of Bolex Creek and the Peace River. So at the end of the day, when this offsite mitigation project is completed, it will also be placed in a conservation easement, which will bump that acreage up from 7,400 to 8,000 acres. So I hope this just gives you a good picture of how, with Mosaic's on-site and off-site mitigation projects, can help greatly increase the amount of conservation lands in these very important watersheds for us. So with that, good timing. Do we have any questions?
Would you be able to speak to what it is that is being mined and the impacts that occur because of the mining, please?
Well, the mining is for phosphate mining, for phosphate rock. So we take a piece of land and identify the mine boundary and our mining activities and whether or not there are wetland impacts associated with that. And then we have reclamation requirements that occur on site as well as mitigation. Okay, and also, actually, Miranda was just telling me we are offering a tour, hopefully to take place next year at our mining facilities as well as some of our reclamation facilities to get a better idea as to what we're doing in Central Florida.
Hi, I apologize if you went over this in your presentation and I missed it, but are you able to get mitigation credits for lands that you don't actually own but just have a conservation easement over and then manage?
Yes, yes, we are.